Part 1, From Prison to Curriculum. Chapter 1, The Birth of the Prison Planet Narrative. The idea that human beings are trapped within a hostile reality is far older than modern spirituality. Across different traditions, people have questioned whether the physical world represents the entirety of existence, whether human perception is fundamentally limited, and whether forces beyond ordinary awareness influence the human condition. These questions are not inherently irrational. They arise from a simple observation. Human beings experience profound limitation while simultaneously possessing an awareness that seems capable of imagining something beyond those limitations. Ancient Gnostic cosmology. Some of the earliest foundations for the modern prison planet narrative can be found in Gnostic traditions of late antiquity. Certain Gnostic schools described a distinction between the transcendent divine source and the material cosmos. The physical world could be understood as a realm of limitation, ignorance, or incomplete knowledge. Within some Gnostic cosmologies, beings known as archons were associated with the administration of the material realm and with maintaining the conditions that kept consciousness from recognizing its deeper origin. The important point is that Gnosticism was not a single unified belief system. Different schools presented radically different cosmologies, and the meaning of the archons varied between them. Over time, however, these complex philosophical and cosmological ideas were simplified into a much more familiar story. Humanity is trapped, the world is controlled. The archons are the jailers. Liberation means escaping the system. This simplified narrative would eventually provide much of the conceptual vocabulary for the modern prison planet idea. From Gnostic cosmology to internet mythology, modern interpretations have combined elements from Gnosticism with ideas drawn from simulation theory, extraterrestrial mythology, conspiracy culture, near-death experiences, occult traditions, and contemporary discussions of consciousness. The result is a remarkably compelling modern mythology. The Matrix becomes the prison, the archons become its administrators, human consciousness becomes the captive. Death becomes a possible mechanism of continued containment, and spiritual awakening becomes an attempt to discover the way out. The internet has accelerated this process enormously. Ideas that once belonged to obscure philosophical or religious traditions can now be combined within a single narrative and distributed to millions of people. Complex traditions become simplified, symbols become literalized, metaphors become mechanisms, and separate ideas that developed independently can begin to appear as pieces of one enormous hidden system. The prison planet narrative is therefore not simply an ancient doctrine rediscovered. It is also a modern synthesis, constructed from multiple streams of spiritual, philosophical, technological, and cultural thought. Why the prison narrative resonates. The power of the prison metaphor comes from the fact that human beings genuinely experience constraint. We are born into bodies we did not choose. We inherit families, cultures, languages, economic conditions, psychological tendencies, and historical circumstances. We cannot simply decide what we will perceive, what emotions will arise, how our biology will function, or how long our bodies will survive. We experience suffering without always understanding its purpose. From within that experience, the metaphor of imprisonment can feel remarkably intuitive. There are boundaries everywhere. There are systems we did not design. There are forces operating beyond our awareness. And there are experiences we would often prefer not to have. The mind naturally searches for an explanation. If these limitations are interpreted as evidence of intentional confinement, then the universe becomes an adversary. Suffering becomes evidence of oppression. Difficult relationships become evidence of manipulation. Psychological patterns become evidence of programming. The framework can become self-reinforcing because almost any experience can be interpreted as further evidence that the prison exists. But there is another interpretation. Perhaps limitation does not necessarily indicate imprisonment. Perhaps limitation is simply a property of embodied existence. A seed is limited by its structure, but those limitations provide the conditions for its growth. A developing mind cannot access everything at once, but that limitation allows learning to occur sequentially. A human being does not begin life possessing complete knowledge because development itself requires movement from the unknown toward the known. The existence of boundaries, therefore, does not by itself demonstrate the existence of a jailer. The psychological consequences of a hostile universe. The interpretation we place upon limitation matters. If every difficulty is interpreted as evidence that reality is attacking us, then resistance can become the central orientation of spiritual life. The individual begins looking outward for enemies. Who is controlling the system? Who created the limitation? Who benefits from suffering? Which entities are responsible? What must be escaped? These questions can produce an increasingly adversarial relationship with existence. The irony is that a philosophy intended to produce liberation can sometimes strengthen the very sense of victimhood it seeks to overcome. If consciousness constantly identifies itself as a prisoner, then the identity of the prisoner remains intact. This book proposes that liberation may require a different starting point. Instead of asking, "Who is imprisoning me?" we can ask, "What is this experience teaching consciousness?" That question does not deny suffering. It changes its interpretation. Pain can contain information. Limitation can reveal capacity. Resistance can expose attachment. Repetition can reveal unresolved patterns. Circumstance can reveal the structure through which consciousness is currently learning. This does not mean that every painful event is consciously designed by some external intelligence, nor does it require accepting a literal cosmic bureaucracy. It means that we can examine the possibility that experience participates in a lawful developmental process. From prison to curriculum. This is where the central proposition of from limitation to liberation begins. Perhaps the universe does not need to be divided into prisoners and jailers. Perhaps what appears to be confinement is actually structure. Perhaps what appears to be punishment is correspondence. Perhaps what appears to be obstruction is developmental friction. And perhaps the beings described as archons are better understood within this philosophical model as administrators of a lawful system rather than malevolent entities whose purpose is to keep consciousness enslaved. The distinction is profound. A prison exists primarily to prevent freedom. A curriculum exists to develop capacity. Both contain boundaries, rules, stages, and limitations, but their purposes are fundamentally different. The question, therefore, is not simply whether reality contains restrictions. It clearly does. The deeper question is what those restrictions are for. If they exist to suppress consciousness, then the prison planet interpretation makes sense. If they exist to develop consciousness, then the same reality takes on an entirely different meaning. The chapters that follow explore that second possibility, not as a doctrine to believe, but as a framework to investigate. Perhaps we have mistaken the classroom for the prison.